Hey guys, Wintermeat here, and today we'll be creating simple damage text using TextMeshPro. So in this empty scene, the first thing we're going to do is import TextMeshPro. It's under Window, Package Manager, and you'll have to wait a second for everything to load up. So once you find it, you can search for it, just hit import, and then you'll be able to create a new TextMesh object. So when you do this, you can go into Game Object, 3D Objects, and you can import the TextMeshPro. And if it's the first time that you've done this in a scene, you'll have to import the TMP Essentials. Now you don't have to worry too much about all the files that are being created, and we're just going to start off by adding our text object. Now this is going to be a game-based text object rather than UI-based text object, which presents a lot of very useful advantages. So first of all, we're going to add some text, and we're going to set the overflow to none, just so that the wrapping to none, just so that we don't have multiple lines, and also so that it can scale sort of predictably. What we're going to do is center it on both of the Y and X axes, so you can see that it scales correctly like this. Alright, so now that we have our text object, we can name it something convenient, and we're going to attach it to a parent. Now the reason we're going to do this is so that the position of the text can be made relative to some sort of arbitrary position as opposed to only in the global position. So you can drag the text object into the parent under the hierarchy, and you'll see that it becomes nested. Then you can reset its transforms. You can just zero out all of the transforms for both of the objects. Now the position of the text is going to be calculated relative to the parent's position, and if the parent moves, rotates, or scales, so will the child. It will inherit the same properties. Alright, so the trick here is that we're going to use Unity's built-in animation tools. So first, we're going to select the text, not the parent, and then we're going to create a new animation. This will be under the Window Animation tab if you can't find it. You can turn on the automatic keyframe recording, and we're going to set up a couple of things. First, we're going to change up the font size. So what we can do is we can set the font to something, and we can also change the color. Now you just drag it around just so that you can see a keyframe, and if you make one you don't like, you can always click on it and hit delete for a property that you don't want. Final thing that we're going to keyframe other than color and text size is the Y position. So we can set this to 0, just make sure the field is red and we have a new keyframe for the Y position on the animation window, and that's all we have to do. Now going to the final frame, let's say halfway through a second, or something like that, we're going to set all of our parameters to what they should be. So this text is going to sort of shrink, go upwards, and fade out. Now you could have it fade to a different color if you like, but it's really up to you. So this is what it looks like in action, and this is our damage text. Now we have a couple more problems that we need to solve before this actually becomes usable. So one of the things that we have to do is we should be destroying this after we use it, because say we want to make a new instance of this every time our enemies get damaged, well, each one of those instances will stay in the scene and clutter it up and consume memory when they don't need to. So we're going to destroy it, and we're going to use animation events to do so. Okay, so in order to create an animation event, you should, an animation event essentially calls a function that is attached to the game object that is being animated. So we're going to create a new C# script, and we can call it destroy on animation end. Now there are several ways to destroy an a game object when its animation is done playing. Such things would be used for like explosions or bullet impacts or whatever. But we're going to do this in the simplest way, which is by animation events. So all we have to do is create a public a public method, which means it's exposed to the inspector and can be set as an animation event. It'll be of a void return type, as we're not going to need to return anything, and we're going to be destroying the parent game object. And you might ask, why are we destroying the parent game object? Well, that's because we want to destroy both the text and the text holder object. So now let's try to get a reference to this. To access the parent, what we need to do is first access the game object that the script is attached to. So we use the lowercase game object with a lowercase g. And parents and children are all attached to the transform component. So what we need to do is do gameObject.transform. That gives us the transform component. And then from there, we can access the parent, which is transform.parent. And then we can only destroy game objects. We cannot destroy transform, so we need to access the game object attached to the parent, attached to the transform, attached to the current game object. So just add a semicolon at the end and save that. So now what we can do is, in order to reference this as part of an animation event, which is again just a function that will be triggered at a certain point in our animation, we're going to create an animation event by hitting the add animation event, and then we're going to find our destroy parent. You can hit D a couple of times in the function menu in order to quickly go to it, as there may be quite a few functions. You're also going to have to add the script component to the object being animated, which is our text, in order for it to show up here. So you can hit D a couple times, as I said, and eventually you'll find your destroy parent function. So select that, and you'll see now that in the hierarchy, the text disappears, which is pretty cool and exactly the behavior that we want. You can also see now the utility of this. We can scale, rotate, and move the origin, and this will not affect the animation. Since the Y position is keyframed of the text, you would expect it to snap back to whatever absolute Y position exists in the animation, but that's not actually the case. If we want to make a couple of tweaks to the animation, we can modify the animation by going directly into the animation tab again, and then we can change the properties. So if we want, we can re-keyframe the final position to be a little bit higher, and we can lengthen the animation so it would be a little bit slower. Now these tweaks are all completely up to you and totally a stylistic choice. And so this is what it looks like now. Again, just to restate the purpose of an empty holder for our animation, since we might want to parent this to our enemies if they were, say, moving, keyframing the Y position would not work. So we have to make our positions relative to something. So now let's create a prefab. The easiest way to do this is just to drag the game object into the content panel, and it'll turn blue. Then you can delete it from the scene. And now you see that if we just drag a couple of these in, we'll be able to see all of them at once, and they're all easy enough to make. So now we have the problem of spawning this in. So let's create our enemy object. What we can do is let's create a sprite. Now this, I'm assuming that you already have some sort of enemy design. If you don't, you can use like a UI sprite, but this is not going to be a very useful game if you don't already have something up and running. You can use any random sprite. I have my own enemy sprite, and I'm just going to relocate this into to having a Z position that's actually visible by the camera, or like a more positive Z position than the camera, which is at -10, and I'll just name it enemy. Alright, so right now it does completely nothing because it's a static sprite. So our goal here is to make that text spawn on top of the enemy when it's damaged. So we'll create a new script called Game Manager. You can call this, again, whatever you like. It doesn't matter, nor does the capitalization. This is just sort of convention that I use. So let's go into the game manager script, and we're going to have to first import the TextMeshPro namespace. So the point of this will be to spawn or instantiate in Unity terms our text prefab when the enemy is damaged. So first, in order to, let's say, set the text to something we want, some custom value, we need to import the TextMeshPro namespace, and we can use the using keyword in C# in order to import this. So write using tmpro and put this at the top of your script with the rest of the imports. Then we need a couple of references to things in the scene. So to make them assignable in the inspector, we can add public, game object, and then we'll have our damage text prefab as well as our enemy instance to which the prefab will be attached to or parented to. Then we can also have a public string, again public so it's exposed in the inspector and we can edit it, and this will be sort of what our text will display. Now, I don't want to create a whole game here, so I'm going to make this simple. You can call this function, you can put this in a function instead of using the input, Unity's built-in input, whenever like an enemy or player gets damaged, but I'm just going to put this as an input. So when you hit X, it's going to pop it up. So the simple way to do this is using the if input get button down key code X, and that is only going to trigger once. And then what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate our damage text prefab. Now, instantiate has a couple of overloads. The one that we're using takes in a game object as the first parameter and a transform to parent it to as the second. Now we're going to use this parent function in order to be able to say, again, if the enemy was to move somewhere, the enemy instance, or the damage text would be connected to it and would move with the enemy instance. Now you may also want to set the local position of the damage text to 0, but I'll show that later on. So in order to make this actually referenceable and so that we can do something with it, what we're going to have to do is set it as a game object and declare it as a new variable. And again, you'll see that in this prefab, our text is a child of our holder. So now we've set the thing that we've instantiated as a game object. So now we can actually manipulate it. So in order to reference it, just call it by the name that we gave it, damage text instance. And then we have to access its child. So again, children and parents are properties of transform. So in order to access the transform component of our game object damage text instance, we can use the getComponentTransform method, or we can simply use the .t transform in order to access the transform game object. In order to get the child, we can use the getChild component or getChild method connected to the transform component. Again, it's the first component. We use 0 indexing in programming, so the first component will be given an index of 0, and there we have it. So our transform.getChild0 will give us a reference to the transform from which we can get our TextMeshPro component, and we can set the text. So we can do this by using the .text equals, or we can use the setText function. It doesn't really matter which one you use. I'll just use the setText, and then we'll just insert our text to display variable with that. Now we can apply this script to anything in our scene right now, either the enemy or the camera, but game managers usually are given their own sort of game manager entity. But I'm just going to give it to the camera right now, and I'll assign a couple of the functions here. So, assign a couple of references. I'll set the text, the drag in the prefab, and a reference to the enemy. And now you can see that when I press X, it will spawn a prefab, and if I open up the hierarchy, you can see that all of these are attached to the enemy. So if the enemy were to move, since the transforms now inherit from each other, the damage text would also move alongside the enemy. All right, that's pretty much all there is to it. If you want, you can make a couple other tweaks. You could make the text appear behind the enemy visually. You could make it appear up above its head, or you could change it to a different color. You could even print custom text like crit for like a critical hit or bleed or something, or you could even put dialogue, although I wouldn't suggest this method for printing dialogue. There are definitely others. All right, so if you want a more flexible version of this, you can also do this procedurally through code rather than using Unity's animation system. Now, I don't want to go over too much coding in this tutorial, so what I'm going to do is I will leave a link to that on my website. You can find that at wintermutedigital.com, where I'll have a full text write-up of this tutorial, sample code, and just an overview, as well as a lot of other Unity tutorials and Blender tutorials that you might want to check out. Alright, so I hope you learned something new from this tutorial, and if you enjoyed it, feel free to give me a like, leave a comment if you want to see any other interesting effects, and make sure to subscribe if you want to see more content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.